We remember the winners, the strongest, the ones who survive, the ones who get to write the story. But for over 3,000 years, the figure who stayed deepest in people's hearts wasn't the winner. It was a man who went out to fight knowing full well he would lose. His name was Hector, Prince of Troy, commander of her armies, and the last man standing before a city on the edge of ruin. That day, he knew, walking out through those gates could mean his death. And the force coming toward him was less like a man and more like a natural disaster. That force had a name, Achilles, half divine and pure, unstoppable rage given human form. Hector knew something else too. If he fell, Troy wouldn't last much longer. And still, he didn't step back. He didn't hide from what was coming. In the end, he stood exactly where he had to stand. This isn't a story about the winner. This is the story of Hector, a man who fought to the very end, knowing he would lose. And it's a story about why, across thousands of years, people have ended up loving Hector more than Achilles, the undefeated hero, who never knew what it meant to lose. This story is based on Homer's Iliad, along with later Greek tragedies and traditions passed down through the ages. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world was beginning to crack at its edges. Somewhere along the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey, sitting at the crossroads between sea and land, there was a city, Troy, also known as Ilios. It was wealthy, built on trade, surrounded by walls that were high and thick and hard to break. The combined forces of Greece hammered at those walls for 10 years and still couldn't bring them down. And at the heart of that city, there was a man, the eldest son of King Priam, Troy's first shield, Hector. The name Hector is generally understood to mean something like holder or protector, the one who holds things together. There's something striking about that. Some people live against their name. Others grow into it completely and carry it all the way to the end. Hector was the second kind. From birth to his final breath, he lived as the person who protected his people. But to really understand Hector, you have to look at him alongside one other person, Achilles. Achilles was the kind of hero myths are built to create. His mother was Thetis, a sea goddess. He himself was faster, stronger, and more brilliant in battle than anyone alive. When he entered the field, the whole shape of the war shifted. When his rage ignited, entire armies trembled. Simply put, Achilles looked like a being made purely for war. Hector was something else entirely. He wasn't half divine. He wasn't born with an invincible body. He was not born with the divine advantage Achilles had. Hector was just a man who bled, a man who could be shaken by fear, a man who had a family to lose. And that's exactly why we hold on to Hector longer than we hold on to Achilles. Achilles was so extraordinary, he became a legend. Hector was so human, he became a memory. That raises an important question. Why did Hector have to fight this war at all? Because this wasn't his war to begin with. It started with his brother Paris. Paris took Helen, the queen of Sparta, and that single act set the whole Greek world in motion. Kings gathered, fleets assembled, and war arrived on Troy's shore. Hector didn't cause any of this. He was a man paying for someone else's mistake. That's the most tragic part of his story. One man's recklessness called down a war. One man's desire lit the fire. And yet it was Hector who had to walk into the flames and try to pull people out. In Book 6 of the Iliad, Hector confronts Paris directly and doesn't hold back. You brought all of this on us. Inside Troy, there were voices calling for Helen to be returned, for compensation to be offered, for the war to be ended. But Paris refused to give her up. And by then, it was too late anyway. Once a war begins, it doesn't stop, just because someone decides it wasn't worth starting. Hector hadn't caused the war, and he'd condemned his brother for it. But the choice left in front of him was simple and brutal. Keep arguing about whether this war was just, or turn around and protect the people standing behind him. Hector chose the second. That's what makes him different. He wasn't the hero of a righteous war. He was a man who chose to protect his people, even inside a war that had no good reason to exist. That's what makes him more tragic, and somehow more admirable. When you add up the ships listed in the Iliad, the Greek fleet comes to around 1,086 vessels. Whether that number is exaggerated or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is what it represents. One city holding out against that scale of force is simply not supposed to be possible, and yet Troy held for 10 years. Why? The walls were strong. The supplies held out. The terrain helped. All of that is true, but the ancient stories are very clear about one thing. Troy held because Hector was there. Hector wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was the anchor his soldiers believed in, the pillar the whole city leaned on. As long as Hector stood at the gates, Troy hadn't fallen. When Hector moved across the battlefield, his men believed they could still win. To the Greeks, he wasn't just an opposing general. Hector was Troy. While he lived, the city wasn't finished. But the reason we genuinely come to love Hector in this story isn't his strength. It's almost the opposite. In Book 6 of the Iliad, there's a scene where Hector slips inside the city walls during a brief pause in the fighting and finds his wife Andromache and their young son. What makes this scene stay with you is how quiet it is. Their son Astyanax was still very small. His father in full armor was unfamiliar to him, and the horsehair plume on top of Hector's helmet, swaying and strange, frightened the child. The boy started to cry. So what did Hector do? He took off the helmet. Troy's greatest warrior, the hero of the battlefield, set the helmet down on the ground simply because his son was scared. Then he lifted the boy into his arms and smiled. This moment hit so hard because what we see for the first time isn't a hero. It's a father. The man who commanded thousands on the field comes home and becomes someone trying to calm a crying child. We admire strength, but this kind of moment is what makes us love someone. That's Hector. And then the scene gets harder. Andromache tells him not to go back out. She tells him he could die out there. She asks what will become of her if he doesn't come back. And this isn't just the fear of someone who loves him. Andromache had already lost her father and brothers to the wider violence of the war. Her father, her brothers, all of them gone. Hector wasn't just her husband. He was the last piece of her world. In Book 6, Andromache says this to him directly. "You are my father and my mother, my brother and my husband." A short sentence, but an entire life compressed into it. To understand the weight of those words, you have to know she had already lost her father and 7 brothers in the fighting. Hector was everything that was left. And standing before her, he doesn't say, "Don't worry." He doesn't say, "I'll win." He doesn't promise to come home. Instead, Hector already knows what happens next. He's already imagining Troy fallen. He already sees, with terrible clarity, what will happen to Andromache after the city breaks, and what it will mean for her. He says that watching that happen before his eyes would hurt him, more than death itself. Think about how painful that is. This isn't a man who doesn't fear death. It's a man who fears what comes after his death more than death itself. He knows what world he leaves behind. He knows what happens to the people he loves, and he still has to go. Because someone has to. Hector didn't love war. He had a reason to fight that was entirely outside himself. Not for glory, for the people standing behind him. This is where the contrast with Achilles becomes impossible to ignore. Achilles is extraordinary, undeniably legendary, but his world tends to revolve around himself. He withdrew from the war when his honor was wounded. He came back not for his country, not for his fellow soldiers, but because his closest companion Patroclus had been killed, and the grief turned to rage. That grief was real. That love was real. But the center of gravity was always himself. Hector's world was everything outside himself. His father, his mother, his wife, his son, his brothers, his soldiers, the people of the city. He carried other people's lives before he ever thought about his own name. If Achilles is the hero of glory, Hector is the hero of responsibility. And strangely, as time has passed, far more readers have found themselves in Hector than in Achilles. In medieval Europe, the standard for heroism shifted. What mattered less was individual immortal greatness, and what mattered more was the chivalric ideal of fighting for something worth protecting. The list of the 9 worthies, the greatest heroes across all of tradition, doesn't include Achilles, but it includes Hector alongside Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar as one of the 3 representatives of the ancient pagan world. That's not a coincidence. In the end, people tend to give their hearts not to the most powerful figure, but to the one who held on the longest. Now we reach the most famous moment in the story, Book 22 of the Iliad. The heart of it all. Patroclus had been killed by Hector. Achilles' closest person was gone. That loss snapped something in Achilles that had no limit. He put on new armor and returned to the battlefield. Homer compares him to the star Sirius, blazing in the late summer sky. Beautiful but ominous, the kind of light that draws your eye and announces something terrible is coming. From the walls above, old King Priam watched and broke apart. A father knows. That isn't just an enemy commander down there. That is a catastrophe. Priam called out from the walls for his son to come inside. Please come back in. If I lose you too, I'm finished. His mother Hecuba wept and begged beside him. But Hector stood at the gates. Most people expect that this is the moment Hector plants himself and faces his fate with cold resolve. But that's not what happens. As Achilles drew closer, Hector turned and ran. He fled. He ran around the walls of Troy 3 full times. This moment matters enormously. Homer doesn't soften it or hide it. He writes it plainly. Troy's greatest hero ran out of fear. And I think that's exactly what makes this scene extraordinary. Right here, Hector stops being a sculpted mythic figure and becomes someone who feels like us. Honestly, most of us are closer to Hector than to Achilles. There are moments when everyone wants to hide from something overwhelming, to put it off, rather than face it, to run if running is possible. Hector felt all of that, which means this isn't a scene of weakness. It's proof that he was human. And what comes next is what truly counts. Hector didn't keep running. At some point he stopped. He turned around, and he looked at Achilles directly. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice not to run after you've already felt the fear. That's why Hector matters. Homer preserves something like Hector's internal voice in this moment. Now my fate has come. Let me not die without a struggle, without glory, but in the doing of something great. What makes those words so heavy is that Hector already knows. He knows this fight can't be won, so he isn't saying he'll win. He isn't saying he'll go home. What he holds on to isn't victory, it's dignity. Even if he can't win, he won't fall apart. Maybe that's the most honest picture of courage we have. Stepping forward when the odds are in your favor takes nerve. But stepping forward when you know you'll lose is something different altogether. Hector is the name we give to that other kind of courage. The two of them clashed, and the outcome is one we already know. Achilles drove his spear through Hector. Even in that final moment, Hector was entirely himself. As he lay dying, he made one last request. Return my body to my father. Let him give me a proper burial. That request isn't a small thing. To people of the ancient world, burial rites were the last dignity granted to the dead, the minimum required for passage into whatever came after. But Achilles refused. His rage wasn't finished yet. And so, with his last breath, Hector told Achilles what was coming for him, that Paris and Apollo would bring Achilles down before long. What's remarkable about this moment is the tone of it. Not a curse screamed in bitterness, but a quiet statement of what was coming, spoken with the last of his breath. Even in dying, Hector wasn't loud, which is why it lands so much harder. And now comes the scene that turns this story into something that lasts forever. Achilles tied Hector's body to the back of his chariot and dragged it across the plain. He kept doing it, circling the tomb of Patroclus, desecrating what was left of Hector. From the walls above, everyone watched. Old Priam watched. Hecuba watched. Andromache watched. The man who had been husband and son dragged through the dust, and they had to keep their eyes open. But then something strange happened. Days passed, and Hector's body didn't decay. The gods were protecting it. That detail is full of meaning. Achilles won the fight, but the gods kept their protection over Hector's dignity. Even in death, the divine wouldn't let him be entirely taken apart. And then old King Priam made up his mind. He would go himself. Think about what that means. An elderly, unarmed king walks alone into the camp of the man who killed his son. That takes a different kind of courage than anything seen on a battlefield. It's a father's courage. With Hermes guiding him unseen, Priam entered Achilles' tent. He knelt before him, and what he said next is among the most devastating lines in all of ancient storytelling. Think of your own father. I have come to do what no man has done before. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son. Hearing that, Achilles broke. For the first time, he saw his own father in the face of an enemy. Priam was thinking of Hector. Achilles was thinking of his father Peleus, and the two of them wept together. What makes this so extraordinary is what Homer chose as his ending. He didn't close this vast war story with a victory cry. He didn't end it with a city falling. He didn't end it with the greatest warrior's triumphant return. He ended it with two men on opposite sides of everything, weeping for the fathers and sons they had each become. And in that moment, the truth of the whole story becomes clear. War doesn't make people win, it makes people lose. And at the center of the deepest loss in this story was Hector. Achilles returned the body. He granted a truce so the funeral could be held. That was the last thing Hector accomplished. Even in death, he brought the fighting to a pause. But the grief doesn't end there. In the traditions that follow the Iliad, Troy eventually fell through. The trick of the wooden horse. The city burned. People were taken. Andromache became a war prize. And in the later tragic tradition, Hector's son, Astyanax, for no reason, other than being the son of Troy's prince, was thrown from the city walls. What makes this particularly devastating is that Hector had already feared it. He wasn't unaware. The image of Andromache taken captive, the danger that would surround his son. These weren't vague worries. He saw them clearly, which is why his fight carries such weight. He was a man more afraid of what would happen to the people he left behind than of what would happen to him. Hector wasn't just Troy's general. To some people, he was their entire family. To others, he was the whole city. To others still, he was the last reason to hope. When he was gone, it wasn't one soldier lost. It was an entire world disappearing. The Iliad ends with this line. Thus, they performed the funeral rites for Hector, tamer of horses.
That's a remarkable way to close. The poem isn't named for Achilles' victory, and the last line doesn't belong to Achilles either. Homer knew, what endures longest isn't the triumph of the winner, it's the dignity of the one who lost. The stories of victors get written into the record. The stories of the defeated get written into the human heart. Achilles is remembered as a legend, but Hector is remembered as a person, someone who felt fear, someone who ran, but someone who turned back around and faced what was coming. A man who took off his helmet because his son was crying. A man who fought thinking of his wife and child. A man who walked out knowing he would likely lose, because he refused to let that be something to be ashamed of. That's why 3,000 years later, we don't read him simply as an ancient general from a distant myth. Because at some point, almost everyone meets a moment that feels like Hector's. A moment when you want to run, but you can't. A moment when you might not win, but you can't back down. A moment when no one else will do it, when you have to hold on for someone else's sake. In those moments, what people need isn't the power of Achilles, it's the heart of Hector. People remember the winners, but the ones they end up loving are a different kind entirely. Not the strongest, but the ones who lasted longest. Not the most brilliant, but the ones who never abandoned their place. And that name is still spoken the same way today. Hector?